5,000 years ago, religion was useful. Why haven't we grown out of it yet?
Because not enough people have read The God Delusion.
Before language developed in humans, how do you think thought was processed?
Oh gosh, that's very interesting. There are people who talk about mentalese as a sort of internal language that is eventually externalized in the form of language. I rather like the idea that language itself, which is uniquely human, by the way. I mean, plenty of animals have systems of communication, but no other animal has the same hierarchical nesting of phrases, the indefinite building up of phrases in the form of if so-and-so, then so-and-so, the man who built the house that Jack built, and so on. This is a hierarchical embedding which requires a level of computation which it looks as though only the human brain has. And I rather like the idea that a predecessor of that, and I suppose this may be present in other animals, is the thought processes. If I do so-and-so, then maybe the so-and-so will happen. If I do this, then maybe that will happen. As a thought process which then became externalized in the form of spoken language. I think that's an interesting possibility.
Given the opportunity to deconvert the very last religious believer, he wouldn't do it.
Yes, I know.
He said, you know, if we'd done it, and he said that he'd been in a conversation with you, and you'd been talking about this. And he said, and he said, if you'd done it and there were one person left, Christopher said, I wouldn't do it. And not just because there'd be no one left to argue with, although there is that, but because there's just something that doesn't feel right about it. And he said, the look that Richard Dawkins gave me remains with me. Can you understand what he was saying?
No, I mean, I get the point about not having anyone to argue with, because he was the world's greatest arguer, and so I get that. But I don't think anything else.
So, to clarify, as I think we did in Los Angeles, given the opportunity to deconvert the very last religious believer, and that means that for good or ill, whatever this religious idea has done throughout history, here you have the lone survivor of ancient wisdom right in front of you, and you have the ability to snap them out of it. The very last one. Do you do it?
Yes.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alex O'Connor. Most of you don't care about that. You're here to see the man who wrote the book that has done perhaps more than any other to convince people to stop believing in God. And no, I'm not talking about the Bible. I'm not usually one for wasting time, ladies and gentlemen, but I will make an exception tonight. Just to remind you that this is Richard Dawkins' last tour. A man of varied passions. At heart an evolutionary biologist, Richard Dawkins has made a career out of engaging in some varied and at times controversial debates with a number of high-profile individuals, including, to name a few, in 2012, Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. In that same year, the biologist E.O. Wilson. In 2007, the comedian Peter Kay, although I'm told that one was something of an accident. In 2012, Brandon Flowers, the lead singer of the rock band The Killers. And in 2000, the philanthropist and celebrity aristocrat, the then Prince Charles. In 2006, of course, he picked his biggest fight with God, and with the God delusion, shifted perspectives of atheism publicly, perhaps more than any other figure before him, although he is now being criticized for his supposition that he is and has all along been a cultural Christian. This has surprised many, but it should surprise none. It's something that is old news. He's been saying it for a long time. And, as my friend John Nelson has liked to point out to me, Richard Dawkins does have all the makings of a perfectly good Anglican. He adores the prose of the King James Bible. He has an affinity for evensong. He loves the sound of church bells. And, of course, he doesn't believe in God. Yes, Richard Dawkins is really here to remind us that, despite being a cultural Christian, all silver linings have a reductionistic, material, scientific explanation. Dawkins has had an impressively hands-on career as well. He's traveled into the heart of evangelical America to, shall we say, try to ask them to reconsider. He's designed evolutionary computer simulations from the ground up just to prove a point. He's even cut open the neck of a giraffe, dissecting it in order to demonstrate the recurrent laryngeal nerve which goes from the brain to the voice box, taking a blunderous detour all the way down the neck and all the way back up again. Richard Dawkins is now also banned from ZSL London Zoo. This is the second of two shows that I've had the privilege of joining Richard for. The last was in America, where I also moderated a conversation between him and Jordan Peterson. If you've ever wondered what it felt like to sit between the embodiment of the left brain and the right brain, look no further than that conversation. I've never felt more like a corpus callosum in my life. Of course, scientifically, the corpus callosum actually does more to inhibit communication between the two hemispheres than facilitate it, so you'll have to make your own mind up as to how I did when that video comes out. It was really at dinner that things got interesting. Professor Peterson took Richard and myself out to dinner afterwards, and you'll know the universal rule that in polite company, you don't mention religion or politics at the dinner table. So, of course, we proceeded to sit for 2.5 hours in complete silence. A silence only interrupted when the waiter finally came over and Jordan said to him, "Well, what do you really mean by order?" What I'm trying to say is that Richard Dawkins has had a varied and wide-ranging career that I think we can all be grateful for. And as I say, this is his last tour. So, if this man's work has done anything for you, be it the selfish gene, through to the God delusion, through to now the genetic book of the dead, then please help me in welcoming the world's most famous materialist, the former professor for the public understanding of science at Oxford University, the inventor of the meme, ladies and gentlemen, Oxford's very own Professor Richard Dawkins.
You can't hear in the wings, so I missed all the jokes.
Probably for the best. No, not really. I'm joking. There's quite a warm reception. They say that a prophet is never welcomed in his hometown, but I think you might have disproved that thesis a little bit this evening. How have you found the reception in the UK versus the American tour that you've just
This is the first gig we've had here. So
how do you find it generally? I mean, Americans typically are seen as being more religious, evangelical, loud.
Not the ones who come to hear me, on the whole. In America, everybody gets a standing ovation, no matter how awful they are. So that's one difference.
And I took mine personally when we were in Los Angeles. You're here to promote, I suppose, a slightly less controversial book than some of your previous ones, which is The Genetic Book of the Dead. In this book, you claim that animals and their ancestral environments can be read like a book, that animals are something of an evolutionary palimpsest. What is a palimpsest?
Palimpsest is a manuscript which has been overwritten, partially erased, or even wholly erased, and then overwritten to save paper or papyrus or whatever it was. And the reason I talk about it is the animal is a book about its ancestral past, then it's got so many different ancestral pasts that the older ones must be overwritten partially by the more recent ones. So that's the main thesis of the book, that we start off with camouflaged animals, which are so beautifully, in detail, perfect in their camouflage, in their resemblance to the background. A desert lizard, I got a picture of a desert lizard which has pebbles and sand grains painted, almost literally painted on its back. And the perfection of this animal and of similar ones, you've probably all seen them, things like butterflies that look exactly like a dead leaf with a vein down the middle and side veins, stick insects, stick caterpillars, moths that look exactly like the tree bark on which they sit. The perfection of this resemblance to the background, that perfection must pervade the entire animal. There's no reason whatever to suppose that such perfection of detail should be limited to the skin. It's no reason why it should be skin deep. I got a quote from Darwin, which I think says it well. This is from The Origin of Species. It may be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers at the improvement of each organic being. So that was Darwin's way of putting it. And I want to emphasize that and say that the perfection of the external part of the animal must pervade the whole of the internal part. And therefore, it must be, in some sense, a description of the environments, the worlds in which its ancestors survived to pass on the genes that did the painting, etc. nowadays. And that's got to be a palimpsest because, as I say, older ones have got to be partially overwritten by more recent ones.
It's obvious in the case of camouflage how, as you say, an animal's ancestral environment is literally painted on its back. You can know what color the trees were. But when we're not talking about camouflage, I mean, the thesis of the book is that it goes deeper than that. What is it that we're looking at? Like, how can animals be read more than skin deep?
Well, we're not talking about physical resemblance, as we are in the case of camouflage, but we're talking about a description of the world, and the chemistry of the past, for example, will be represented in the chemistry of the animal at present. J.B.S. Haldane made the point that our blood is salty because of our ancestral origins in the sea. That may be slightly fanciful, but that's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Do we have any examples in human beings today of the kind of thing you're talking about, our ancestral environment being imprinted into our biology?
Well, I suppose you could say something like, rather negatively, back pain, which so many of us suffer from, is a memory, a genetic memory of the fact that we used to walk on all fours, and now our spine is protesting at the more recent overwriting, the more recent palimpsest overwriting of standing up vertically.
I've heard this characterized as something of an evolutionary blunder. Do you believe in that concept, and what do you think it helps to demonstrate? And can you think of any other examples?
Natural selection has bungled again, as John Maynard Smith said. Yes, well, you mentioned, I did hear one fragment of your opening speech about the recurrent laryngeal nerve of the giraffe, well, actually of all tetrapods. And this nerve has a ridiculous detour, especially in a giraffe, but even in us, it starts in the head and it goes down, and the end organ is the larynx, and it goes down and loops itself around a big artery, and then straight back up again. And in the giraffe, that is a very substantial detour. In a sauropod dinosaur, it would have been even greater. And this is clearly bad design. The vertebrate retina is back to front. The wires that connect the photocells, the retinal cells that are sensitive to light, to the brain, come from the front rather than from behind. In mollusks, they come from behind, which makes sense. That's good design. The vertebrate eye is badly designed. The German biologist and physicist Helmholtz said that if an engineer had presented him with the vertebrate eye, he would have sent it back.
So in the case of the recurrent laryngeal nerve, if this design is so poor, could you give us a picture of why it might have evolved in that way?
Well, poor design is actually quite rare. I mean, mostly we're bowled over by the beauty of the way animals are fitted to their environment. So these revealing flaws, they are revealing because they're rare. But mostly it's perfection.
So in the case of the recurrent laryngeal nerve, it will have something to do with the extension of the neck over time.
It's a historical relic. In our fish ancestors, the equivalent of that nerve, fish don't have a larynx, so the end organ would have been one of the gills. And the direct pathway from the brain to the end organ would have been south of the equivalent of the artery. And so when the neck started to lengthen, fish don't have a neck, but when the descendants of fish, like reptiles and mammals, started to develop a neck, the marginal cost of each tiny little increment in the detour, the looping detour, would have been very slight compared to the major cost of uprooting the whole nerve and changing the whole embryology so that the nerve was jumped over the artery. So we've got to think in terms of marginal cost. It's a concept that economists are very fond of. The marginal cost of each millimeter of increase in the detour was very, very slight compared to the major cost of the embryological upheaval of inventing a better design.
We were talking about humans. Human beings have, perhaps uniquely, developed an ability to severely, seemingly, impact the selective pressures of evolution. Whereas in an amoral system, you have survival of the fittest and death of the weakest. Now, human societies have designed systems, at least in some places, whereby the weakest members of society can be cared for and their survival can be, their chances can be improved and sometimes ensured. Given enough time, our interference with natural selection will surely make it difficult for historians of the future to read our ancestral environment in the same way.
Yes, I suppose that's a good point. I mean, it's not a thing. I would not advocate the abolition of doctors for that reason. I'm rather fond of doctors, but it is a point that we have slackened the selection pressures on us. We've rather feather-bedded ourselves against those selection pressures. No doubt we've got other ones, but yes, you're correct.
And do you think that would make it difficult for the historian of the future to do what you're hoping the biologist will do of animals in the past? Which
Yes,
is read their ancestral
I suppose it
environment?
would. Yes, I suppose so, yeah.
So all of this works on a gene-centered view of evolution, something you expand upon in the book. Where are we at in terms of the most recent criticisms and debates around the accuracy of this view, which you're perhaps most known for?
Yes, well, there's a chapter in the book about criticisms of this whole selfish gene view, and we're not talking about just this book now, we're talking about my whole view of evolution, which is based upon the idea that the unit of selection, that which survives or fails to survive in the Darwinian process, is the gene. And the rationale for that is that the gene is potentially immortal in the form of informational copies, not the actual physical DNA itself, because that's very short-lived, but the information contained in the letter-by-letter sequence in DNA is potentially immortal. That mean, by immortal, I mean going on for potentially millions of years, unchanged. And what that means is that it's the only part of the living system which has that property. And so when we talk about natural selection, when we talk about something surviving and something failing to survive, you could say that about individuals, you could say that about groups, you could say that about ecosystems, you could say that about lots of levels in the hierarchy of life. But the gene is the only one where survival versus non-survival actually has a permanent effect. The individual survives or doesn't survive, but it eventually dies anyway. I mean, individuals are not potential going on into the future. Genes are. We die, and our genes go on. And that's the rationale for the selfish gene point of view. Now, one criticism which has surfaced recently by my colleague Dennis Noble in this university, where he regards DNA not as a causal influence in evolution, but as something useful that the body needs in order to make protein. Now, of course, it's true that proteins are synthesized as a result of the code in DNA. And for Noble, that's its purpose. DNA is there as a kind of library. When you want to make when the body wants to make a protein, it goes to the DNA library and reads off the necessary bit of DNA and makes the protein. He does not regard DNA as having an essential causal role. And I do, precisely because of what I was saying earlier. A gene that is good at surviving, it has a causal influence on its own probability of surviving, and it does so via embryological processes causing bodies to be good at surviving and good at passing on those genes. There crucially has to be a causal influence by the gene on the body and consequently on its own chances of surviving to the next generation and the next and the next and the next. So that the causal influence of genes is absolutely crucial to the Darwinian process. Nothing else has that property. You might say that since we all, let's say, inherit an arm, I mean, our parents had arms and we have arms, so you might say, isn't the arm something which is replicated? But it's not. The key test of that is, well, if you break your arm, the children don't inherit the broken arm. If you break a gene, your children do inherit the broken gene and all its consequences.
Yes, you've somewhat pessimistically, perhaps, described in this new book genes as a gigantic colony of symbiotic viruses.
Yes, well, that's what I call the sting in the tail. That's my little bit of speculation relegated to the last chapter to keep it sort of safe. Maybe some readers won't get that far. It's not as radical as it sounds, actually. I make a distinction between two kinds of parasite, longitudinal and horizontal parasites. Parasites that go down through the generations, call them verticoparasites, where the way in which the parasite gets itself into the next host is via the gametes, via the eggs, probably eggs, of the present host. That's a verticoparasite. A horizontoparasite is one which gets into the next host by some sideways route, for example, by being sneezed out and breathed in by another host, or coughed out, or released in the form of diarrhea into the water system and then imbibed. So these are all horizontoparasites. Now, if you think about the possible phenotypic effect, the effect that the genes in a parasite might have on its host, a verticoparasite, in quotes, wants exactly the same thing, exactly the same outcome as the genes of the host itself. So any gene which has the effect of making the individual host better at surviving, reproducing, better at being a parent, but sexually attractive, good at building nests, and all those things, verticoparasites have exactly the same interests at heart as the animal's own genes. Horizontal parasites clearly don't. Horizontal parasites, for all they care, the host can die, blow up in a cloud of spores and get passed on that way. So if that's right, and is right, that a verticoparasite, a good example would be mitochondria, which are little organelles inside the host, inside all our cells, which are originally bacteria. They are bacteria, but they've been living in us for billions of years, and they've become totally and utterly symbiotic. We're mutually dependent. And the reason is that they pass to the next host in the eggs of the present host. It only goes down the female line. So that if they had any phenotypic effect, if they had any influence on the host, it would be to the same end as the genes of the host itself, of the human, let's say, itself. So let us hear the conclusion to the whole matter. Every one of our own genes is mutually cooperating in building a body that does all the things that a body does to reproduce and to survive, cooperatively. And the reason our own genes cooperate is simply and solely that they have the same hope of the future. By hope of the future, I mean they pass to the future in the same vehicles which are the gametes of the host. And the same is true of mitochondrial genes, the same is true of any verticoparasite genes. So that means that we can, if in a sort of sense, this is my sting in the tail, a sort of sense say that all our own genes are equivalent to a vast colony of symbiotic viruses.
Quite something. I think one of the great examples to help people understand what you're talking about with environments imprinting themselves onto animals is in cases where we've seen somewhat accelerated cases of natural selection. We spoke last time about the moths in the Industrial Revolution, which evolved to become darker quite quickly. What kinds of examples can we point to help people understand this?
Well, do you want me to talk about that example, Biston betullaria? It's a very well-known example. It's one of the few really good examples we have of natural selection in action, and it comes because of the Industrial Revolution in Britain and other industrial countries, where the whole countryside became blackened and tree trunks became blackened. And a number of species, of which the best known is Biston betullaria, the peppered moth, started to produce, they already did produce a black morph, a dark form, which is a mutant. But what happened in the Industrial Revolution is that natural selection started to favor the black ones. And because they were less conspicuous on tree bark than the pale-colored peppered moth. And Bernard Kettlewell, in this university, devoted himself to demonstrating this, and he showed that when he compared populations in industrial areas, say near Birmingham, comparing with rural areas in Dorset, he found that in the industrial areas, the black ones predominated, in the Dorset and the rural areas, the pale-colored ones predominated. And he actually observed birds selectively taking the pale-colored moths in the industrial areas and the dark-colored moths in the rural areas. And so what we've seen over the past couple of hundred years with collectors collecting these moths is that the frequency in the population of the dark moths in industrial areas has increased dramatically, and not in the rural areas.
You mentioned in passing last time something about mosquitoes on the London Underground.
That's another example. Mosquitoes living in the London Underground have become adapted to living underground and feeding on passengers in the
as we well know.
Yeah.
Convergent evolution is an interesting concept.
Yes, we have a chapter on that. Convergent evolution is one of the most striking demonstrations of the power of natural selection. Something like the Australian mammal fauna, the marsupial fauna of Australia, because what happened when the great southern continent of Gondwana broke up, and Australia went one way, and South America went another way, and Antarctica went another way, and so on, from Africa. As it happened, the mammals that Australia got, the early mammals, were marsupial, and so the mammal fauna of Australia is almost exclusively marsupial. The exceptions are bats, for obvious reasons, because they can get there by flying, and more recent introductions like dingoes and rats. But mostly, Australia is peopled by marsupials. And because there are a whole lot of different ways of life in Australia which parallel the ways of life that are available in the Old World, you get a range of marsupials which look convergent, which converge upon mammals in the Old World and separately in South America. And so we have, in Australia, we have marsupial wolves, that Thylacinus just now extinct, lasted in Tasmania until living memory. And marsupial rabbits, marsupial moles, marsupial mice, and so on, all looking like and behaving like and living like their opposite numbers in the rest of the world, but entirely independently evolved. So the marsupial mole in Australia looks like a mole, behaves like a mole, because it has the same way of life. And there are other moles as well. There's a South African mole, which has also independently evolved the mole way of life. And that's not related to our mole, that's related to elephants. And so we have, again, this convergence of on the mole way of life, and there's convergence on the dog way of life, convergence on the lion way of life, and so on.
I remember speaking to you at one point about, I can't remember what animal it was that was going, that went from the water, out of the water, back into the water, back out of the water again. Yes,
okay. There are lots of animals which, having moved out of the water onto the land, you remember all our ancestors lived in the water, and then the tetrapods, vertebrates, moved out onto the land in form of reptiles, amphibians, mammals, and so on. And then some of them went back to the water. Quite a lot of them did. Dugongs and manatees, whales, turtles, seals and sea lions, partially. So quite a lot of them went back. And then tortoises, uniquely, that's what you're referring to, yes. I think. Tortoises then went back again to the land. So whereas we had ancestors which were fish in the water and we came out on land, whereas whales had ancestors in the water, came out on land, went back into the water again. Tortoises had fish ancestors, came out on land, went back to the water in the form of turtles, and then came back onto the land again as land tortoises, in some cases in very dry land indeed. So that's the only example I know of a sort of doubling back. There may be others.
Is that something that's going to be difficult to read as a genetic book of the...
Well, it is a palimpsest, and it's going to be rather a complicated palimpsest.
But will we be able to tell with accuracy exactly how many times this happened, exactly when it happened?
Not exactly when. It's possible to read it by looking at fossils and by looking at by examining the adaptations to show that the ancestors were in fact aquatic or terrestrial, as the case may be.
I wanted to ask you more broadly, especially myself not being a biologist, what do you think is the most misunderstood concept in evolutionary biology?
Well, I think there are several. One is the underestimation of the amount of time involved, and so people sometimes just don't grasp that there's these huge amounts of time. So you hear people saying things like, "Well, I'll believe in evolution when I see a monkey give birth to a man," kind of thing, because they don't recognize the time involved. Then again, I think there's the improbability. Many of them think that evolution is a matter of chance, because they think the only alternative design is chance, and therefore you do a sort of probability calculation, the probability of getting all the bits in the right place, whether it's a molecule or a body. The probability of getting all the bits in the right place is negligible. I mean, it's 1 in billions, and they don't realize that it happened gradually, and you don't suddenly get something like an eye, all the bits falling into place in one fell swoop. What you have is a gradual improvement from a very simple, primitive eye, a gradual improvement step by step by step. In an earlier book, I used the analogy of what I called Mount Improbable, where you have a great big vertical cliff, and on top of the cliff is an eye, and the idea of making an eye in one fell swoop is equivalent to jumping from the bottom of the cliff to the top. And obviously you can't do that. So you go around the other side of the mountain and you find there's a nice gentle slope. And you just creep up the slope gradually. And that's what really happened, because you get to the bottom of the slope, you have hardly an eye at all, just say a light-sensitive spot. And then you have a sheet of light-sensitive cells, and then you have that sheet bending into a slight cup, which can't form an image, but sort of gives us kind of vague idea of what direction light or dark is coming from. And then the cup starts to close in like that, gradually closing in. And you get a pinhole camera, which is a crude image-forming device. It's very dim, it's very inefficient, but it is a kind of image. And then a lens forms by to begin with, any kind of transparent gubbins inside it, which acts as has a slight focusing effect, and then that gradually improves and so on. So that you have a gradient all the way up the slope of Mount Improbable to the top, where you have this very, very beautifully designed thing with its imperfections as well.
What can we make of the criticism from so-called irreducible complexity? There appear to be things which are very difficult to imagine evolving piecemeal in this way.
Yes.
Michael Behe's famous analogy is with a mousetrap, where if any of those pieces are missing,
yes,
it doesn't function at all. How does half a wing help an ant?
Yes, that's usually a lack of imagination. I call it the argument from personal incredulity. What's the use of half a wing? That's a particularly easy one, actually. Half a wing is better than a quarter of a wing, and a quarter of a wing is better than an eighth of a wing. If you just imagine an animal like a squirrel, which leaps from bough to bough in a tree, and it's important not to fall short, because then you crash down. So there's a certain distance which a squirrel can jump. I don't know what it is. And then if you imagine that the squirrel has a slight increase in membrane between its elbow and its ribs, just a little slight one, then that slightly increases the distance that it can jump. Well, a forest contains a whole set of different distances of boughs from each other. And no matter what distance you think of, there'll be a slightly greater distance which you could jump if you only had a little bit of a membrane. And that means an even greater one if you had a slightly bigger membrane. And so the membrane just gets bigger and bigger until you have a membrane stretching from the tip of the finger to the tip of the toe. And these are familiar. There are a lot of convergent animals that have that. There are flying squirrels. There are at least two different sorts of flying squirrel among rodents. There's the so-called flying lemur of Southeast Asia, which is not a lemur, but it has the same idea, and also the membrane embraces the tail in this case. There are similar flying lizards, so-called, they do it by means of having the ribs sticking out and membrane joining the ribs. Well, that gets you to a nice glide. These creatures they don't exactly fly, they don't flap their wings, they glide maybe as much as 100 yards from one tree to another. So it's a superb piece of gliding. And they can, to some extent, steer by moving their limbs like this, and they can guide themselves as they glide down. Well, it's not that difficult to imagine going from there to flapping a bit, and this could give rise to a bat. And
I've even seen somebody try to actually show how a mousetrap might, in theory at least, have evolved. So
yes, the mousetrap is the one that I've forgotten the man's name, probably deliberately.
Michael Behe, I think. Michael Behe.
Behe, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And the refutation of Michael Behe is very well given in Kenneth Miller's book. Kenneth Miller is very valuable to us because he's a devout Roman Catholic, and so he can kind of talk to everybody.
What about in your own work, be it evolutionary or be it something else? What do you often find is the most misunderstood thing that you have advocated or stood for, perhaps in audience Q&As and things like that?
Oh, goodness. Probably get some examples tonight, I think. Let me think. Have you got any suggestions?
Well, I wonder how you feel, for instance, about the recent furore over your cultural Christianity movement.
Oh, yes, that's very unfortunate. I was on the radio, and I think I said I was a cultural Christian. And all I meant was that I was brought up in Christian schools, and so I'm very familiar with the Bible and with the Psalms and with hymns, and so I kind of feel embedded in a Christian culture. But I think a lot of people rather eagerly seized on that as meaning that I was somehow halfway towards being a proper Christian. Like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who, by the way, is talking at this moment in the Sheldonian. Yes. It's very unfortunate.
Whoever put that together.
It was not deliberate. But she became, I think she became a political Christian, and then actually now she's become a real Christian. And I think she's sincere.
Well, the term cultural Christianity is used by some to mean something like a desire for or an advocacy for something like the fruits of Christianity.
Yes.
And it sounds like maybe that's not quite what you're doing.
It's far from yes.
I mean, do you only mean by saying that you're a cultural Christian that you happen to have been brought up in that culture, or do you mean that you kind of like it, that you prefer it?
Well, I've been caught out saying that before. I don't want to, it's too eagerly seized upon. I don't want to say that. I just want to say I'm embedded in a Christian culture, went to Christian schools, and if you ask me, if you produce a quotation from the Bible, I might recognize it.
Mm-hmm. We spoke about this before, but people always like to ask you this. They accuse the new atheists of having created something of a meaning vacuum into which other ideas can fill. I know that you respond to this by saying that you're against all kinds of nonsense and that should do the trick.
I'm accused of opening the door to wokery.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I understand that that's something that you have also had some choice words about. But even if you're against the thing that came to fill its place, can you still be held in part responsible for opening that door, even if you thoroughly condemn the thing that washes in after it?
You could, I suppose. Yes, I wouldn't like to admit that, but I could imagine somebody saying that.
Well, in light of that possibility, when you look at the project of new atheism, are you proud of it?
I'm not sure if it ever was a project. That's a phrase that was a journalistic phrase that was invented not by me and not by any of my colleagues, not by Christopher Hitchens or Sam Harris or Dan Dennett or indeed Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And so I don't think we can really be blamed for a project that we didn't undertake. We simply wrote a book and discovered that some of our colleagues had written a book at the same time. So I don't think there ever was a project. And so whether it failed or succeeded is really not really relevant.
Well, you did start to sort of team up and debate and give talks, as if you had sort of something that you wanted to do to the world. Do you consider it to have been a success?
Yes, I mean, I took part in at least one debate together with Christopher Hitchens, and that was quite fun. I don't think... Well, it would have been rather good if it had been a project, I suppose, but I don't think it was.
Do you think overall you look back on it as a success? I mean, clearly in this country, Christianity is less than 50% for the first time, but globally speaking, Christianity, for example, seems to be on the rise. And so I wonder what the scope of this
Yes, I mean, I think you're right,
that
that Christianity is declining in Europe and America. America's lagging behind, but it could be that overall in the world, if you count Africa, say, it may be increasing. Is that what you meant?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that doesn't surprise me. I suppose if you say there was a project, well, those 4 books would have been read in Europe and America, and if they're not read in Africa, that's unfortunate, but that could be why.
We said a moment ago that even if you condemn the thing that comes in after you open the door, it's still possible that by opening that door, something worse has been ushered in. And in that respect, especially as, at least in the minimal sense, a cultural Christian, do you in any way regret the attack on Christianity?
Yes, I mean, you could say it would have been better to... I think Ayaan Hirsi Ali herself started off when I called her a political Christian. That was really her rationale, that she felt that Christianity was a bulwark against something worse. I mean, quote Hilaire Belloc, always keep a hold of nurse for fear of finding something worse. That's not I don't think that's a very good maxim for refraining from criticizing irrationality when I see it. The fear that if you criticize this form of irrationality, an even worse form will take its place. That might have been her way. My way is to criticize irrationality wherever I see it.
You're asked quite often about Jordan Peterson, and I don't like to follow that theme, but we did just sit down a few weeks ago for your first recorded conversation with Jordan Peterson in a number of years, the previous of which was something of a disaster. It's the first time that you've sat down and had perhaps a semi-productive conversation and even got to spend some time at dinner with him afterwards. I wonder, given that you have had some choice words for Dr. Peterson in the past, did that event change your opinion of him in any way?
Well, the first time was a meeting in Oxford without an audience, and indeed both were without an audience, and it was requested by him, and it wasn't very fruitful. I didn't really get very many words in edgeways. I was able to tackle his belief that DNA, in some sense, is a Jungian archetype, that if you look at various forms of primitive art, you often find snakes coiling around each other. And he thinks that that's some kind of primitive awareness of the double helix of DNA, which is, of course, utter nonsense. Then in the second meeting we had just recently in Arizona, that had the benefit of a moderator, which was you. And I don't always think moderators are a good idea, but in this case it was pretty well essential. It lasted a long time. It was filmed. I suppose it'll be released on YouTube or somewhere like that.
Today, I think.
Yes. Did you say
today?
Today,
I believe. Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. And my impression is that he is, well, as I told him, drunk on symbols. He doesn't seem to care very much about whether propositions are true so much as whether they have some kind of deep symbolic resonance, some kind of, perhaps with a Jungian archetype. So, for example, he is very, very keen on the biblical story of Cain and Abel. You know, Cain slew Abel in a fit of jealousy because Abel's burnt offering was favored by God and Cain's wasn't. And Jordan Peterson thinks that this is a very important story that somehow has symbolic significance for the whole of humanity, which is fair enough. I mean, Jungian archetypes are fine. But he then says something like, Cain and Abel were the first humans to be born naturally. Well, that betrays, I mean, obviously he doesn't think Cain and Abel actually existed on the one hand, because he's a rational modern human, and he knows perfectly well that Adam and Eve didn't exist and their children Cain and Abel didn't. But nevertheless, he said the first humans to be naturally born. So that's muddling up fact with symbol. It's not, and I tried to pin him down to say that however important symbols might be, facts are important too. And you can't just deny, you can't just ignore facts or skate over them. If you're asked a factual question, is this true or not? I tried to pin him down on virgin birth. Was Jesus actually born of a virgin? And it didn't really matter to him. He didn't care. What matters is the symbolic significance of being born of a virgin. And I think this is probably characteristic of a certain type of theologian generally. They're just not interested in facts, only interested in metaphorical significance.
One thing that I might take from listening to his interaction with you is specifically with regards to the genetic book of the dead, the idea that genes, be what they may, can cause ancestral environments to be imprinted on animals. You can look at an animal, look at its genetic makeup, and just know something true about its ancestral origin. Do you think there's any truth in the idea that this can happen in a mimetic sense with something like the evolution of religious ideas, that the ideas that have survived mimetic competition throughout humanity, which will now manifest as things like the Christian story, are, in a sense, a demonstration of the truth of our ancestral...
I think very likely, yes. I think that's a very interesting thought, and I'd like to explore it. It does seem to me to be possibly a very fruitful line of thought.
It seems to me that was perhaps something that captivated Jordan Peterson in talking to you, but like you say, sort of struggling to...
Yes, I mean, he wanted to say that Jungian archetypes are memes, or memes are Jungian archetypes.
Yes.
And I sort of thought that was vaguely plausible, but not very interesting.
I remember before we spoke to him, I said to you, well, one of the questions he'd been interested in was, what's your definition of God? Like, what is the image of God that you have in your head? And you said to me at the time, well, I should be asking him what his definition of God is.
Yes.
And true as that may be, if you write a book called The God Delusion, and you talk about God not existing, even if just to negate the concept, you must have something in your mind that you are talking about as not being real or being delusionary.
Yes.
And I think some of the biggest criticisms of your work in this regard, from David Bentley Hart, for example, have been that the thing that you're attacking is essentially the wrong conception of God. So what is your conception of God?
The kind of God which I think is extremely interesting, if it existed, would be an intelligent creator who invented the laws of physics and laid down the physical constants and started the universe off and possibly intervened later. So a God who is a divine mathematician, a divine physicist, a creative force. Now, the theory, the hypothesis that there does exist such a being is a very exciting, interesting hypothesis, which, if it were true, would totally revolutionize science. I mean, everything we do in science would be totally revolutionized by the thought that actually there's a designer that did it all. And so that's the kind of God that I think doesn't exist, but which would be very interesting if it did.
And when you hear people say that God is not that, God is not some author of the universe that sets things up.
Yeah, well, what the hell is it then?
Well,
yeah,
that's the question.
yes.
Is
Well, you read theology, so
So I did, and at risk of turning this into a debate for the last 9 minutes,
yeah.
I mean, there are lots of ideas, right? And there are, you'll know, even if you think that they're talking nonsense or you don't agree with them, that the amount of interactions you've had with sophisticated theologians, they must tell you that the image that they have of God is at least different from yours.
Yes, well, what, like what? I mean, if it's not a creative intelligence, it is a creative intelligence, even in their view.
So you would say that even as broad as saying a creative intelligence, you would sort of confidently say this is illusory.
That's the kind of God I'm interested in debating about. If there's another kind, like what?
Well, where's Jordan Peterson when you need him? For risk of time, I think we should leave it there. I mean, theologians will say that God is just being itself. God is the same thing as good. God is the same thing as truth. But I imagine that doesn't resonate with Richard Dawkins.
It leaves me cold.
I wanted to ask about something I already asked you in LA, but just for the sake of a new audience as well. Near the end of, or just after Christopher Hitchens died, there was a book written by Larry Taunton called
Yes.
The Faith of Christopher Hitchens,
Yes.
which attempted to show that near the end of his life, Hitchens may have been flirting with faith in a way that might surprise people. What did you think of that book? And are you worried that the same kind of thing might one day happen to you?
I have read it. I have read it. I think it's a disgrace. It doesn't exactly say that Christopher Hitchens became a Christian, but it sort of comes as close as he dared. I regard it as speaking ill of the dead. Christopher Hitchens is no longer here to defend himself, and I think it's thoroughly disreputable. The same thing happened to Darwin, by the way. Mm-hmm. There was a woman called Lady Hope who went and called on Darwin and alleged that he had had a Christian conversion on his deathbed. And it is a hazard that faces certain people.
And just to really put this in stone, do you think that there is any chance whatsoever that something like that might in fact happen to you?
That somebody might allege it, or it might actually happen?
That it might actually happen?
Absolutely zero chance that it might actually happen.
Well,
as Christopher Hitchens himself said, actually, he said that if anybody alleges that I had a deathbed conversion, I must have lost my marbles. I mean, didn't put it quite that way, but that's what he meant.
Yeah. I asked you before, and we're about to go to the Q&A cards. I asked you before, I found this really interesting. Before we had an in-person Q&A, I said, well, what's your least favorite question that you've been asked throughout your career? And I was quite surprised to hear you say that, at least in that moment, free will came to mind, that you dislike being asked about that.
Well, that's a very common one. Do you believe in free will? And I hate the question. And I usually resort to Christopher Hitchens' answer, which is, do I believe in free will? I have no choice. But I also hate the...
I wonder what else there is that you dislike.
Yeah, I hate the what advice would you give a young person question.
Yes, actually, I remember in LA, you said, I asked what your least favorite question is, and you said the free will question. And then we went to Q&A, and somebody came up and said, I was just wondering what advice you might give to a teacher. And you said, earlier when I was asked about my least favorite favorite question, I did feel a bit bad for the chap, but you understand why people would come to you looking for advice, especially as a teacher, as he was. He teaches biology, and you've done so much to communicate. You must have learned some lessons about how to get these ideas across, especially to hostile audiences, that you might be able to share with people.
Well, that's a bit different. It's a bit. I mean, the advice to young people, young person, I hate that. But how to get ideas across? Put yourself in the position of the reader, of the listener. Try to say what might be misunderstood about what I've just written. Read it again and again and again through different eyes and try to say, how might this be misunderstood? Try to see how might this be misunderstood. And that's what I do all the time. And if I have any success in getting ideas across, I think it's because I put myself in the position of the reader. And it's amazing how few people actually do that. If you read, there's just sort of instruction manuals for how to, I don't know, build an IKEA piece of furniture or something. Put yourself in the position of the reader is a fundamental maxim that ought to be obeyed.
I think we can agree that you've done a pretty good job of that. And we'll see how that continues when we move to Q&A, which I think is about time for. So we have pre-submitted questions, which I'll take a hold of now. Thank you so much. So I believe that these were written as people were coming in.
So they didn't hear what we've been talking about.
So they haven't heard what we've been talking about, unfortunately. So we'll see how many of these we can get through. First, we spent the afternoon in the Ashmolean Museum. 5,000 years ago, religion was useful. Why haven't we grown out of it yet?
Because not enough people have read The God Delusion. I'll try and do better later.
Okay, next. Before language developed in humans, how do you think thought was processed?
Oh, gosh, that's very interesting. There are people who talk about mentalese as a sort of internal language that is eventually externalized in the form of language. I rather like the idea that language itself, which is uniquely human, by the way. I mean, plenty of animals have systems of communication, but no other animal has the same hierarchical nesting of phrases, the indefinite building up of phrases in the form of if so-and-so, then so-and-so, the man who built the house that Jack built, and so on. This is a hierarchical embedding which requires a level of computation which it looks as though only the human brain has. And I rather like the idea that a predecessor of that, and I suppose this may be present in other animals, is the thought processes. If I do so-and-so, then maybe the so-and-so will happen. If I do this, then maybe that will happen. As a thought process which then became externalized in the form of spoken language, I think that's an interesting possibility.
In the mid-2000s, two phenomena occurred. You and a few others wrote well-read books arguing against Christianity and religion, which sold very well. Second, there was a strong decline in levels of religious belief in Europe and America. Which was the cause and which was the effect?
Or neither.
Or neither.
I think I have to be humble and suggest neither. But I would very much like to think that our books were a cause. I know they were in the case of certain individuals because I get letters saying so, but whether that had a sort of statistical effect that we're talking about, I wouldn't like to say. I can't quite see how it could go the other way. I mean, I can't see how you could make a causal arrow from a statistical decline in religion to 4 people writing books.
Well, I suppose the popularity of the books and the way they were received, do you think that people were reading these books and thinking, gosh, that's interesting and that's why they did so well, or were people sort of already on board and that's why the books were received so well?
Yes, possible. I do think a lot of people have said to me, not that they were converted by my book, but that it articulated what they thought all along.
Yes, I think that Wittgenstein opens the Tractus by saying something like, this book may only be useful to people who are already convinced of the argument that is contained within it. And maybe something like that is going on with new atheism, at least implicit in the question. What do you think the next big breakthrough in science or evolutionary biology is likely to be?
In science, I suppose you could, including physics, which is not my science, I suppose the theory of everything and the unification of quantum theory and relativity. In biology, in evolutionary biology, I think perhaps the origin of life, which is a bit of a mystery, and it may always remain a mystery because it happened a very long time ago, and we may never be able to recreate a model for what happened. I think the best we could hope for there would be a model which is so brilliant that you sort of feel it has to be true. I doubt if we could ever actually prove it.
Do you think there's a future where religion and science coexist? What's your view currently on this relationship between religion and science?
No, I don't think so. If by religion you mean what I said earlier, which was a belief in a creative intelligence, I don't think so. If religion is defined in some kind of a different way, I suppose it might be, yes.
So just belief in the supernatural creator, you think, is destined to always be incompatible with science?
I think that, yes, I do think that's incompatible with science, but I think that we never really got to grips with much in the way of alternative definitions, but if there might be one that, I mean, if it's just the spirit of goodness or something, then what the hell does that mean?
Do you think that science and religion, or when you talk about sort of the creative power behind the universe being at odds with science, is that in the sense of science giving us reason to think it can't be the case, or more in this sort of non-overlapping magisterial approach, that they just have nothing to do with each other?
No, I'm strongly against that. I mean, it's not impossible that there is a creative intelligence. That's a very interesting hypothesis, a scientific hypothesis. I mean, there's one hypothesis that we're all living in a simulation. And that's very hard to refute. And if it's true, then that is a creative intelligence. But my feeling there would be that whoever did the programming of that simulation must have evolved, or that you can't have an infinite regress there. It must have evolved, or must have been the product of another simulation which had to have, where the creator had to have evolved. You can't. I don't think, in my view, it's scientific to say that there just was a creative intelligence. It has to have evolved. If we are the product of a creative intelligence, then that creative intelligence must have evolved.
Somebody's asked here, do you think human beings are the last stage in evolution? If not, what comes next?
Well, I don't think there's any reason to expect there should be a last stage in evolution. If humans were wiped out, went extinct, then it's possible that some other creature would evolve. By last stage, I presume that would mean, the question must mean superior in some way, superior in...
Complete, I suppose?
Well, no, that doesn't mean anything. I don't think, I mean, every creature, every species is the last stage in its own evolution, because it's the tips of the twigs of the tree. But by last stage, I take it that means in some kind of progressive sense that we are the only species that's produced intelligence and language.
Perhaps.
Yes, and so if we went extinct, would dolphins take over and that's possible, but we shall never know.
Somebody's asked here, in light of the rapid advancement of genetic engineering and artificial intelligence, how do you think it might affect human evolution, and what might be the implications? That question is from Martin Nayland, I think.
Well, I suppose artificial intelligence might take over and leave us behind. And so we might, that might be the future of evolution. And we might disappear and be represented purely in the form of our artifacts. Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal, is of the opinion that if we ever encounter extraterrestrial life, it will not be in the form of the biologically evolved life, it will be in the form of the artifacts which they created and which have a much greater lifespan than the original life form. So it's possible that the future of humanity, the greater part of the future of humanity could lie in silico.
And what about genetic engineering?
Yes, well, this is speculating into the science fiction future. Genetic engineering could have very dramatic effects upon human evolution. Human evolution could become intelligently designed rather than evolving by natural selection.
I think somebody asked at the last Q&A, it was unfortunate because I think we both might have misunderstood their question. They asked about the influence of cosmetic surgery on evolution. And I think we both thought, well, cosmetic surgery doesn't have an effect because it's not genetic. But thinking about it afterwards, this may have been a question about mate selection. Again, a little bit like how human beings are adapting their environment to evolve in unnatural ways. You might call it unnatural selection. What do you think is the future, as the previous questioner, I think, asked, of human evolution in this world of mate selection being totally warped by things like cosmetic surgery and the possibility for genetic engineering and just the fact that we care for the weak out of a feeling of moral obligation to them?
Well, there's a lot in there. I mean, mate selection, cosmetic surgery, these are very different things. Do you mean that the standards of beauty were so modified by artificial plastic surgery and so on?
Well, people are able to exhibit signs that people would usually be quite influential in mate selection, but now they're essentially falsified and fake.
Yes, I don't think I select my mate in that way. Not sure how to answer that.
Somebody said, it seems to me that the evolution of Darwinian life is inevitable once you have the chemistry in place and self-replicating molecules like RNA, DNA, or whatever. What about evolution of intelligent life? Is it as inevitable? Are mammals, as primates, more likely to evolve intelligence?
Yes, that's very interesting. I think there are a handful of major steps in evolution which led to eventually intelligent life, and that the origin of life itself is one thing, as the question says, and then the origin of the eukaryotic cell, when there was a symbiotic union between prokaryotic bacterial type cells to produce the complicated cells that most of the animals and plants we're familiar with, all except bacteria and archaea, have. And then multicellular life, where instead of having single cells, cells club together to form these huge, great lumbering machines, which are built of billions of cells. That's another step. And then the production of nervous systems and the production of advanced nervous systems that are intelligent. And each one of those could have been a major step, which could have been a very improbable event, and which, if we're thinking about extraterrestrial life, it could be that, for example, there's a lot of kind of bacteria-type extraterrestrial life all around the universe, but rather few examples where they've broken through to a large entity, a large body, which might be capable of intelligence and of communicating with us, because if we ever do encounter extraterrestrial life, it almost certainly will be by radio, almost certainly by picking up radio signals from outer space. And so the barrier to producing an intelligence level, a technological level, to actually generate very powerful radio transmitters would be a big barrier. And so then maybe that the universe may be crawling with life, but life capable, advanced enough to broadcast radio signals could be very rare.
I think there's also this concept, well, there's a concept in philosophy of the philosophical zombie, that is a biological organism which acts in exactly the same way as a conscious being. It even reacts to pain, it shouts out, all of this kind of stuff. But there is just actually no first-person conscious experience. It just does it as a mechanism, a bit like Descartes' view of what animals were. Given the possibility of that, well, I suppose I should first ask whether you think that's possible. Do you think that there could have evolved this philosophical zombie?
I find it very hard to deny that. I've always thought so. I've always thought that it's hard to imagine what subjective consciousness is all about, what it's for. And I don't even know that you're conscious. I suspect you are, because you came into the world in the same kind of way as I did, and I know that I am. But trying to refute the idea that the intelligent zombie that you were talking about could work, it could work. I've no doubt about it. It certainly could.
In that case, what could be the evolutionary purpose of this mysterious thing, the first-person conscious experience, if there are animals that could have existed in exactly the same way, just without the experience?
I find it very baffling, and I would love to understand that.
Do you have any sort of pet favorite theories about consciousness, the origin of consciousness, what it is, what it consists in?
No, I haven't. I've read Dennett, I've read Humphrey. I just don't come down in any particular favorite.
You think it's a question for the scientist or a question for the philosopher?
I think it might be for both. It might also be for computer scientists, actually. I think that may be where the answer comes from engineering.
What sparked your passion for evolutionary biology? Where did it start?
The fascination with complexity, the fact that living things, including us, are so incredibly complicated and so incredibly elegantly designed, far, far beyond what you'd expect from just physics. And so that's what led me into my curiosity about biology, the explanation for the existence of prodigious levels of complexity which you get in living things.
A related question that I've found among this pack is, what is your favorite species or animal from the Genetic Book of the Dead?
Well, I like the whole of life. I mean, there are some species that amuse me. I'm very fond of Veros shifaka, which is a lemur in Madagascar. All lemurs are in Madagascar, but what it does is it dances on its hind legs with its arms in the air in a kind of cavorting way across clearings. That's very comical. But yeah, okay, well, let's do, if you must have an answer.
Somebody asked before what you think the biggest breakthrough will be in evolutionary biology, and you said the origin of life. Seems like we might be quite far off that. A related but different question, what do you think is the most promising area of research currently in evolutionary biology?
I suppose the use of DNA sequencing to discover the entire pedigree of life, the actual family tree, relationship, the tree of cousinship of all life.
What are your thoughts, says one questioner, about the growing divide of what's morally right and wrong and what we're seeing in the world right now? Do you think there is a growing divide between morally right and what we're seeing in the world right now?
Not quite sure what that.
'Cause I'm not sure.
Driving at.
I'm not sure either. But I suppose there is an idea that the world is sort of getting worse in some respects, maybe politically or maybe in terms of our culture, that it's somehow getting worse. Is that something that you perceive?
I've read Steven Pinker, the Better Angels of Our Nature, where he argues just the reverse, that look, if you look at the broad sweep of history, it's getting better. And I found that rather persuasive. I found that our notions of what's right and what's wrong are getting better. I mean, we no longer send children up chimneys. We no longer have slaves. We treat the sexes equally. We don't. We still ill-treat animals, but not much less than we used to. We don't have entertainment of throwing cats on fires in order for the entertainment value. We don't have public executions, and the number of people who suffer violent deaths, amazingly, is going down. It doesn't feel like it, but Pinker gives very good evidence that that homicide is on a downward curve.
What do you think accounts for the feeling, as evident by at least one questioner here, that the world is getting worse, the apocalyptic feeling of our current...
Yes, well, again, Pinker suggests that it's, and I think plausibly, that bad news is news. Good news doesn't hit the headlines. So you never see a headline which says things are getting better. You'll only see a headline which says there's been a disaster or a war or that.
A lot of sort of moralized talk there throughout the history of your career, especially with regards to your religious discussions. People have criticized atheists for not having a grounding for morality. You just use a lot of morally charged language. What is your idea about what morality is? Do you just see it as an evolutionary construct, or do you think there's truth of the matter?
I think that moral philosophy is a very respectable subject, and moral philosophers who do things like base it on the golden rule and then generalize from that. That is a way of providing, of designing a sort of society that we might wish to live in. I certainly don't think you need religion for that, because I mean, if you based your morality on religion, it would be very unpleasant. So the best we can do, I think, is to think morally, to do moral philosophy, and think about designing society and the sort of society we'd like to live in.
People want to ask, in a situation where people have different moral standards, people have different ideas, including the religious people that you mentioned, you say that would be a bad idea. Well, they say that it's a good idea. And somebody over here says that maximizing human pleasure or flourishing is a good idea. What metric can we use to...
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, do you maximize the sum of human happiness, the sum of happiness of sentient beings? Do you maximize... do you give priority to certain kinds of being rather than others? There are all sorts of... Do you minimize suffering? Do you minimize pain? You get a different answer with each of those axioms of morality. But whichever axiom you choose, there's then quite a lot of logical thought going on to derive a good code of action following from those axioms.
Do you think there's any way of determining answers to those questions that don't just rely on subjective whim, but are in some sense true?
I don't think there is any such way. I think Sam Harris thinks that minimizing suffering is so obviously the axiom we should be following. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. You could imagine a different axiom. So I think you can't actually say that any one of those axioms is the right one. But you can say, once you've got an axiom, you can then do quite a lot of rational thought about what follows from it in the sense of rules for action.
Do you have a conscious axiom that is at the basis of your view of morality?
I think minimizing the suffering of sentient beings is close to it.
Somebody here has asked about artificial intelligence and the effect that it will have on science and human power in terms of scientific discoveries. Oftentimes the AI discussion is focused around AI consciousness and this kind of stuff. But in terms of what it will allow us to do, for example, the protein folding was solved by artificial intelligence. What do you think about the power of AI in scientific discovery?
I'm rather bowled over by how successful it is. I mean, you mentioned the protein folding problem. That's proteins are strings of amino acids, and it's a one-dimensional string of amino acids which is determined by DNA. The effect of that protein, the work that it does, depends upon its folding into a three-dimensional structure, and that's determined by the laws of chemistry. And it's a very, very difficult problem to predict how a given string of amino acids will fold. It ties itself into a kind of knot. And that's what this brilliant AI program does. It can actually predict what the three-dimensional form of protein will fold itself into.
And can you see this artificial intelligence being used in the future in similar ways? I mean, it's kind of difficult to imagine how AI would determine where life came from, or something like this, but I mean, are there areas that you're optimistic about when it comes to AI?
Yes, I mean, I've been so impressed so far that I wouldn't like to set a limit on what it might do. I'm not impressed by some of its factual knowledge, but I think that's probably easy to remedy.
Yes. In your career of debates and discussions, again, about biology, about God, about whatever, you've encountered a lot of objections. What has been the strongest, most challenging one, or one that has been particularly challenging? Has anything kept you up at night as a result of any of the debates and discussions that you've had over your career?
Well, you mentioned so many different things. I mean, science or religion or
Well, let's take the religion. I think that's been the most contested thing you've done.
No, I don't think anything keeps me up at night. I suppose the nearest approach would be the fine-tuning point that the physical constants, the sort of half dozen or so numbers that physicists can measure, and which are very important, but which they don't have a rationale for. They don't understand why these constants have the value that they have, things like the gravitational constant. And the theoretical demonstration that if any one of those constants was slightly different in value, if you imagine a set of knobs which you could twiddle to change the value of the gravitational constant and the other fundamental constants, then the universe wouldn't exist and we wouldn't exist. So the reason we exist is that these fundamental constants are precisely tuned to certain values. Some people think you can derive theism from that, or at least deism from that. I don't, because I think you're simply pushing the problem back and wondering where the creator, where the divine knob twiddler came from. And one of the ways that physicists solve the problem is to say there are other reasons coming from theoretical physics. There are other reasons to expect that there is a multiverse of many, many universes, all of whom have different fundamental constants. And we obviously have to be living in, if there's a minority of these universes that has the fundamental constants set to exactly the right, tuned to exactly the right values, then we have to be in such a universe because we exist. That's the anthropic argument. And so I think that's probably a consensus among a lot of physicists. A lot of other physicists think that we just don't yet understand why they have the value that they do, and when we have a theory of everything, it'll all fall into place.
Given the opportunity to deconvert the very last religious believer, he wouldn't do it.
Yes, I know.
He said, if we'd done it, and he said that he'd been in a conversation with you, and you'd been talking about this, and he said, and you said, well, if you'd done it and there were one person left, Christopher said, I wouldn't do it. And not just because there'd be no one left to argue with, although there is that, but because there's just something that doesn't feel right about it. And he said, the look that Richard Dawkins gave me remains with me. Can you understand what he was saying?
No, I mean, I get the point about not having anyone to argue with, because he was the world's greatest arguer, and so I get that. But I don't think anything else.
So, to clarify, as I think we did in Los Angeles, given the opportunity to deconvert the very last religious believer, and that means that for good or ill, whatever this religious idea has done throughout history, here you have the lone survivor of ancient wisdom right in front of you, and you have the ability to snap them out of it. The very last one. Do you do it?
Yes. I mean, I suppose it's a little bit like, and this is, I'd give a different answer if you said the last person to speak some language. Mm. I think that's sad when a language dies, but I don't think that the parallel works.
But why is it sad when the language dies?
Hard to say. I don't know. It's like when a species goes extinct.
And you don't feel that way about a species of idea, because I think that's actually a great way of trying to picture.
Yeah,
I think what
I was trying to get at.
Maybe Hitchens is getting
Yes,
at.
I was trying to.
But you don't feel the same way.
I don't think I do, no.
There you have it, folks. I think we're just about out of time, but I'm hoping that you can all help me one more time in thanking, on his last tour, Professor Richard Dawkins.